There are wars that do not begin with the sound of marching armies, nor end with clear declarations of victory or defeat. They begin in silence, in spaces where nothing appears to be happening, yet everything is already in motion beneath the surface. The story of Dothan is one of those wars. If you are following this exploration of hidden layers of history, perception, and unseen forces shaping human reality, consider subscribing and following the channel. Because what follows is not merely an ancient narrative, it is a recurring pattern embedded in how we understand power, fear, and truth even today. In the ancient land of the Kingdom of Israel, tension was not an occasional disruption, it was a constant condition of existence. Across the border, the military power of Syria was expanding its reach, tracking movements and seeking to eliminate a very specific target. That target was not an army, nor a fortress, nor a political leader in the traditional sense. It was a single individual, Elisha, a prophet whose significance did not come from political authority or military strength, but from something far more unsettling: perception. Elisha was not a commander of troops or a strategist of empires. He lived quietly, almost invisibly, within the turbulence of the region. Yet paradoxically, his presence alone was enough to shift the strategic calculations of nations. He became a priority target, not because of what he could destroy, but because of what he could see. The city of Dothan, where this moment unfolds, was not a major capital or a fortified stronghold. It was small, modest, almost insignificant on the geopolitical map of its time. Yet history often concentrates its most decisive turning points in such overlooked places. For in the logic of power, information is sometimes more valuable than armies, and a quiet city can become the center of a global strategic imbalance. A military force from Syria was deployed in secrecy. Their objective was precise: locate, isolate, and neutralize Elisha. This was not a symbolic operation. It was a calculated military intervention. Surrounding the city were chariots of iron, a symbol of overwhelming technological and tactical superiority in ancient warfare. These were not merely vehicles of combat, they were statements of inevitability. When such forces appeared, resistance was expected to collapse before it even fully formed. From a purely physical standpoint, the situation was already decided. A small, vulnerable city was encircled by an elite force, no visible escape routes, no comparable military response, no structural advantage. And yet, war is never fully contained within the physical layer of reality. Inside Dothan, the atmosphere tightened like a closing grip. The silence outside the city walls was not peace, it was pressure, a kind of stillness that signals imminent collapse rather than calm. Every sound felt amplified, every pause carried weight. Fear spread not through direct confrontation, but through awareness. The people did not need to see the enemy clearly to know they were surrounded. The perception of entrapment was enough to shape their entire reality. At the center of this psychological tension stood Elisha, but unlike those around him, he was not defined by the visible structure of the siege. The difference was not in what he saw, but in how he saw. When his servant stepped outside and witnessed the full extent of the encampment, horses, chariots, disciplined military formations encircling the city, he was overwhelmed. To him, the situation was absolute. There was no ambiguity, no interpretation, only inevitability. "We are finished," his perception silently concluded. But Elisha did not respond within the same framework. He did not deny the physical reality of the siege. The army was real, the encirclement was real, the danger was real. Yet he operated from a different layer of interpretation, a different map of reality entirely. Where his servant saw only containment, Elisha saw structure beyond containment. Where others saw isolation, he perceived a broader system not visible to ordinary perception. This is the critical divide in the narrative. Two individuals occupying the same physical space, yet living inside two fundamentally different cognitive worlds. One world is defined entirely by material forces: soldiers, weapons, geography, and tactical positioning. The other includes elements that cannot be measured directly, yet fundamentally alter the interpretation of everything that is seen. The servant's world collapses into fear because it is closed. Elisha's world remains stable because it is open to dimensions beyond immediate perception. And it is within this contrast that Dothan becomes more than a historical siege. It becomes a model of how reality itself is constructed in the human mind. What appears as a military standoff is, at a deeper level, a confrontation between limited perception and expanded awareness, between what is seen and what is assumed, between physical force and interpretive structure. And as the story continues beyond this moment, that boundary between visible and invisible reality begins to shift in ways that challenge not only ancient warfare, but also the modern way we understand threat, power, and control. Inside the silent pressure of Dothan, where fear had already begun to solidify into expectation, something subtle yet irreversible was about to occur. The servant, still shaken by the sight of encircling armies, stood frozen in a reality that appeared complete, closed, and absolute. In his mind, there was no gap left for interpretation, only the certainty of defeat tightening its grip. Then Elisha did something unexpected. He did not command troops. He did not negotiate. He did not prepare for escape. Instead, he spoke a simple request that carried no military weight, but immense cognitive significance. He asked that the servant's perception itself be transformed. "Open his eyes," he prayed. This moment is often misread as metaphorical, but within the logic of the narrative it functions as a shift in mode of awareness. It is not the world that changes first, it is the observer's capacity to register the world. The servant's opening of eyes is therefore not an addition of new physical data, but a restructuring of perception itself. The battlefield remains unchanged in material terms. The encircling army of Syria is still present. The city of Dothan is still surrounded. The threat has not diminished in quantity or proximity, and yet everything changes. Where before there was only the narrow corridor of visible siege, there is now expansion, an extension of reality into dimensions previously filtered out. The servant is no longer confined to a single layer of interpretation. His cognitive frame has widened, and what he sees fractures his prior certainty. Surrounding the hills beyond the physical army is a second formation, vast, luminous, and ordered. Nuingua Vaselua, mountains filled with horses and chariots of fire. These are not presented as decorative imagery, but as a structural counterweight to the visible siege. In narrative terms, they represent a force that exists on the same battlefield, but not within the same perceptual bandwidth. They are not additional troops. They are an entirely different category of presence. At this moment, the psychological architecture of the scene shifts. The servant is forced to reconcile two simultaneous realities, one grounded in physical evidence, the other grounded in expanded perception. Both occupy the same spatial coordinates, yet neither can fully reduce the other. From a cognitive science perspective, this can be interpreted through the mechanism of selective attention. The human brain does not perceive reality in its totality. It constructs a usable model of reality based on filtered sensory input. This filtering process is not passive, it is actively shaped by expectation, fear, and prior belief structures. What we call reality is therefore not raw data. It is a stabilized simulation generated by the brain, continuously updated to maintain coherence. When Elisha asks for the servant's eyes to be opened, what is being altered is not the external environment, but the filtering threshold itself. The attention filter expands. Previously excluded information is now allowed into conscious awareness. In this expanded state, reality becomes multi-layered. The physical system remains intact. Soldiers, weapons, and encirclement still define the visible structure of conflict. But alongside it emerges a second coordinate system, one that cannot be measured in tactical terms. This system is built from perception, meaning, and interpretive depth. It is the domain in which fear, certainty, and trust are formed. The servant now exists simultaneously in both systems. In the physical coordinate system, he is surrounded and vulnerable. In the perceptual coordinate system, he is no longer isolated, but embedded within a larger protective structure that was always present but previously unseen. This dual existence creates an immediate cognitive dissonance. The brain attempts to reconcile contradiction, but instead of collapsing into confusion, something unexpected occurs: stabilization through expansion. The presence of the second system does not cancel the first, it reframes it. What was once interpreted as total vulnerability is now recontextualized as partial visibility. Fear, which depends on perceived totality of threat, begins to dissolve when totality is no longer assumed. At this point, Elisha speaks again, not with urgency, but with composure. His response reflects not a change in external conditions, but the confirmation that those conditions were never complete in the first place. The servant's emotional state begins to reorganize. Panic, which thrives in the absence of perceived alternatives, loses structural dominance. In its place emerges a new baseline, not certainty of victory, but certainty of non-isolation. This is a critical distinction. He does not suddenly believe the physical army has disappeared. He does not deny risk. Instead, he now perceives that risk is not the only active force in the system. The emotional trajectory shifts accordingly. From acute panic, where perception narrows and time feels compressed, he moves toward cognitive spaciousness, where multiple interpretations can coexist. From isolation, where he believed he stood alone against overwhelming force, he transitions into a perception of embedded protection within a larger structure of unseen order. In modern terms, this is a transformation of threat appraisal. The stimulus remains unchanged, but the interpretation of threat magnitude is recalibrated. The brain's prediction model updates, and with it, emotional output stabilizes. What was once a sealed system of fear becomes an open system of awareness. And within that opening, the servant is no longer merely a passive observer of siege, but a participant in a layered reality where physical and non-physical structures coexist without contradiction. This is the threshold the narrative carefully constructs, the point at which perception itself becomes the decisive battlefield, not armies, not weapons, but the architecture of attention. And as the servant stands between these two coordinate systems, one visible, one previously hidden, the foundation is laid for a deeper understanding of power, not as dominance over space, but as mastery over what can be seen, interpreted, and ultimately believed. As the servant's perception stabilized and the invisible dimension of the battlefield became undeniable, the narrative does not end its transformation there. Instead, it shifts focus outward, toward the very force that initiated the siege, the military apparatus of Syria. Because the most unsettling implication of Dothan is not that perception can expand, but that perception itself can be manipulated, redirected, and rendered strategically useless. What the army believed it was executing was a precise operation: locate, surround, and eliminate Elisha. From their perspective, the mission was linear, rational, and grounded in superior intelligence. They had coordinates, reconnaissance, and tactical advantage, everything aligned with the logic of control. But embedded within this operation was a structural error they could not detect. They were operating inside a closed model of reality, while the actual system was not closed at all. This is where the concept of tactical blindness emerges, not as a failure of vision, but as a failure of interpretive alignment. The army did not simply fail to see Elisha correctly. They failed to see the environment in which seeing itself was being manipulated. They believed they were navigating space. In reality, they were navigating perception. And perception, unlike terrain, can be rewritten without moving a single physical object. Within this framework, what appears as a traditional military operation begins to resemble something closer to cognitive warfare. Not in the modern technological sense of signals or devices, but in a deeper structural sense, the alteration of decision-making pathways through controlled misalignment of perception and outcome. The army of Syria advances with confidence, unaware that their internal map no longer matches the external reality they believe they are engaging with. They are not being physically obstructed. They are being misoriented. This is the core of what can be described metaphorically as divine electronic warfare, not a disruption of machines, but a disruption of certainty. The targeting system remains functional, the weapons remain intact, the soldiers remain disciplined, but the meaning of direction has been altered. In such a condition, even perfect execution leads to unintended positioning. The army moves with precision, yet arrives at the wrong interpretation of its own movement. The paradox intensifies when the force that believes it is hunting becomes the force that is guided. The troops, trained to eliminate a single target, find themselves instead being led deeper into unfamiliar terrain, until the distinction between pursuit and entrapment collapses entirely. From their perspective, they are advancing toward resolution. From the actual structure of events, they are being repositioned within a controlled narrative boundary. This is the moment where military superiority begins to lose its traditional meaning. The army still possesses overwhelming physical capability, iron chariots, disciplined formations, logistical strength. But these advantages depend on one critical assumption: that the target exists in a stable, locatable position within a predictable map. Once that assumption fails, all subsequent calculations degrade. The true reversal at Dothan is not that the army becomes weaker, it is that its coordinates become irrelevant. They arrive at a location believing it to be strategically optimal, yet that location has already been redefined by a higher order structure of perception. What they thought was a target zone is, in fact, a manipulated convergence point. This is the essence of strategic paradox. The more precise the operation, the more vulnerable it becomes to misaligned assumptions about reality itself. At this stage, the concept of technological superiority also begins to dissolve. The chariots of iron that once symbolized invincibility are no longer decisive. Their effectiveness depends entirely on correct spatial and informational alignment. But when the battlefield is no longer purely spatial, when it includes perceptual and interpretive layers, then hardware alone cannot guarantee coherence. A weapon is only as accurate as the map that defines its target, and if the map is altered at the level of perception, then accuracy becomes irrelevant. What emerges is a form of systemic neutralization, not destruction of forces, but removal of their operational clarity. The army is not defeated in a conventional sense. Instead, it is rendered unable to reliably interpret its own position within the unfolding situation. This is why, in the broader structure of the narrative, the confrontation at Dothan cannot be understood as a simple military engagement. It is a demonstration of how power collapses when its underlying model of reality becomes outdated. The most advanced force in the region is not overcome by a stronger force in the same category. It is destabilized by a shift in category itself. Physical dominance presupposes stable perception. But once perception is no longer stable, once multiple layers of reality coexist without hierarchy, the entire logic of domination begins to fail. The army of Syria still moves, it still acts, it still executes commands with discipline. But the meaning of those actions has been quietly decoupled from predictable outcomes. And in that decoupling lies the true vulnerability, not exposure to enemy strength, but exposure to interpretive collapse. Dothan, therefore, is not merely a siege that is resolved by intervention. It is a demonstration of how entire systems of power can become obsolete without being physically destroyed, simply by losing alignment with the structure of reality they assume they are operating within. After the structural collapse of certainty that overtook the military forces of Syria within the Dothan encounter, the narrative reaches a critical turning point. The forces that once advanced with confidence, guided by precise intelligence and overwhelming technological superiority, now find themselves disoriented, not destroyed, but cognitively destabilized. And yet, what happens next is not the expected culmination of violence. There is no execution, no retaliation, no symbolic punishment to reinforce dominance. Instead, the center of the narrative shifts once again toward Elisha, the figure who, throughout this unfolding sequence, has not operated as a conventional military actor, but as a stabilizer of perception itself. When the captured soldiers are brought before him, the situation contains all the ingredients of irreversible escalation. In a traditional geopolitical logic, this is the moment where deterrence is established through force. The enemy is vulnerable, isolated, and within reach. History, in countless parallel scenarios, would predict a demonstration of power designed to prevent future incursions. But Elisha does something structurally different. He chooses not to optimize for destruction. Instead, he chooses to reconfigure the entire meaning of victory. The captives are not eliminated. They are not imprisoned as leverage. They are not used as symbols of dominance. Instead, they are hosted, fed, given water, and restored before being released. This act is not sentimental. It is not an absence of power. On the contrary, it presupposes a level of control so complete that retaliation becomes unnecessary. Because here, power is no longer measured by what is destroyed, but by what can be reinterpreted. The decision transforms the battlefield logic entirely. What was once a closed loop of attack and counterattack is interrupted by an act that does not fit within the expected algorithm of war. For the army of Syria, the experience becomes disorienting at a deeper level than tactical defeat. They are not simply spared, they are recontextualized. The enemy they came to eliminate does not behave like an enemy within their operational framework. Instead, he acts as if the framework itself is secondary. This introduces a shift from military logic to psychological logic. Victory, in this new configuration, is no longer about territorial gain or force reduction. It becomes about destabilizing the assumptions that generate conflict in the first place. By feeding and releasing the captives, Elisha effectively breaks the recursive cycle of hostility. The expected narrative, capture leads to execution, execution leads to retaliation, retaliation leads to escalation, is interrupted at its foundational level. What replaces it is not weakness, but a different architecture of dominance, one that does not require continuation of violence to sustain control. From a strategic perspective, this marks a transition from kinetic superiority to cognitive superiority. The battlefield is no longer defined by movement of troops, but by movement of interpretation. And this has long-term implications that extend beyond the immediate encounter. When captured forces are treated in a way that contradicts expected patterns of warfare, the predictability of future aggression begins to erode. The psychological cost of engaging with an opponent who does not conform to retaliatory logic increases, not because the opponent is more violent, but because the opponent is less readable within established frameworks of conflict escalation. In this sense, the act of mercy becomes a strategic disruption. Over time, such disruptions alter behavioral chains. Military planning depends on forecasting responses. But when responses deviate from expected punitive logic, the predictive model itself begins to degrade. Decisions become less certain, calculations less reliable. The result is not immediate peace, but a gradual recalibration of aggression thresholds. In the broader regional context involving Israel, this type of intervention introduces a stabilizing pressure, not through deterrence by fear, but through deterrence by unpredictability of moral outcome. The enemy can no longer assume that victory or defeat will follow standard scripts of punishment and retaliation. This creates a form of strategic ambiguity that reduces the momentum of escalation cycles. But the deeper significance of this moment lies beyond geopolitics. It introduces a conceptual redefinition of what it means to hold absolute power. Because if power is truly absolute, it is not constrained to destruction. It includes the capacity to choose not to destroy, even when destruction is possible and justified within conventional frameworks. This is where the narrative transitions into its most abstract layer, the ethics of uncontested authority. Elisha's decision reframes power not as accumulation of force, but as control over the direction of meaning. The ability to transform an enemy encounter into a moment of restoration reveals a different optimization function entirely. Instead of maximizing damage, the system is optimized for restoration of coherence, transformation of hostility into non-hostility, restructuring of perception within the adversary. In modern analytical terms, this can be understood as a shift from zero-sum logic to system-level recalibration. The goal is no longer to reduce the opponent to incapacity, but to modify the conditions under which opposition is generated in the first place. This is why the narrative frames mercy not as absence of power, but as its highest expression. Because only a system that is not threatened by reversal can afford to remove the mechanisms of retaliation. And within that removal, something more durable than dominance emerges. Stability rooted not in fear, but in altered expectation. The encounter at Dothan, therefore, does not conclude with annihilation. It concludes with a reprogramming of the logic of conflict itself. And that reprogramming becomes the true legacy of the event, not as a military victory, but as a demonstration that the most effective form of control is not the elimination of opposition, but the transformation of the cognitive structures that generate it. As the Dothan narrative expands beyond its ancient battlefield, its logic does not remain confined to history. Instead, it begins to reappear in modern forms, subtle, dispersed, and far more difficult to identify because it no longer arrives as an army at the gates. The visible siege has evolved. What once appeared as iron chariots surrounding a physical city has transformed into a more complex and less tangible structure, the invisible siege of the modern world. In this updated landscape, the forces that encircle human perception are no longer uniform military formations from Syria or any other singular geopolitical actor. Instead, they manifest as layered systems of pressure that operate continuously across daily life. These modern chariots of fire no longer roll across physical terrain. They move through information, expectation, and interpretation. They can appear as economic instability, shifting markets that compress decision-making horizons and force reactive behavior. They can appear as media cycles, continuous streams of information that redefine urgency faster than it can be processed. They can appear as geopolitical tension, global events that shape perception of safety without requiring direct proximity. Or they can appear as internalized pressure, personal uncertainty that mimics external siege conditions even in the absence of immediate threat. In this sense, the modern equivalent of encirclement is not spatial, it is cognitive. A person may live in physical safety, yet still experience the psychological structure of being surrounded, not by armies, but by unresolved inputs, competing narratives, and constant informational demand. This is why the Dothan pattern remains relevant. It describes not only an ancient siege, but a recurring architecture of perceived threat. Within this architecture, the first essential skill is recognition. And recognition begins with distinguishing between two fundamental categories, facts and interpretations. Facts describe observable conditions. They are anchored in external verifiability. Interpretations, however, are the mental structures built upon those facts. They determine emotional response, perceived urgency, and perceived agency. Most forms of modern anxiety do not arise from facts alone. They arise from interpretations that amplify, compress, or distort those facts into perceived totality. This is where the concept of an invisible siege becomes psychologically precise. It is not that external reality is always threatening. It is that internal interpretation systems can construct a sense of encirclement even when no physical encirclement exists. The mind begins to behave like the servant at Dothan before his perception expanded, seeing only the immediate layer of constraint, without awareness of alternative structures operating beyond that layer. To navigate this condition, the critical shift is not to eliminate information, but to reorganize how information is framed. This is where strategic perception replaces reactive perception. Reactive perception responds to surface-level inputs, crisis headlines, economic fluctuations, social signals, or immediate pressure points. It behaves as if each input is isolated and absolute. Strategic perception, however, treats these inputs as part of a system. It asks not only what is happening, but what structure produces what is happening. This shift mirrors the earlier transformation in Dothan itself, moving from a single visible layer of reality to a multi-layered system where unseen structures influence visible outcomes. In modern terms, this means shifting attention from events to patterns, from outcomes to mechanisms, from symptoms to systems. When this shift occurs, the sense of being encircled begins to loosen, not because external conditions necessarily change, but because their interpretation changes. The siege loses its totality. A key component of this reorientation is the role of belief and vision. In the Dothan narrative, Elisha does not deny the existence of threat. Instead, he operates from a broader perceptual framework that includes dimensions not immediately accessible to ordinary observation. Translated into contemporary terms, belief functions as a cognitive radar system. It does not replace data, it organizes it. It determines which signals are interpreted as dominant and which are interpreted as contextual. Without such a framework, perception collapses into immediate stimuli. Every signal appears urgent, every change appears decisive, every disruption appears final. With a stable interpretive framework, however, signals are placed within hierarchy. Not all inputs are equal, not all threats are absolute, not all pressures define total reality. Vision, in this context, becomes a replacement map for fear. Fear thrives in the absence of structure. It expands when interpretation is fragmented or incomplete. Vision counteracts this not by denying uncertainty, but by embedding uncertainty within a larger coherent model. This is precisely what the servant experienced when his perception expanded. The external situation did not become less complex, but it became more contextualized. The presence of the mountains of fire did not erase the army. It redefined the army's significance within a larger system. Similarly, in modern life, the goal is not to eliminate all forms of pressure, economic, informational, or geopolitical, but to reposition them within a broader interpretive architecture. Once this repositioning occurs, the psychological effect is profound. What previously felt like isolation begins to feel like participation within a larger structure. What felt like fragmentation begins to feel like layered coherence. The invisible siege does not disappear, but its authority over perception weakens. And in that weakening, a new form of stability emerges, not based on the absence of threat, but on the presence of a wider field of understanding. This is the modern translation of Dothan's central insight, that reality is not only what surrounds us physically, but also what is constructed through the boundaries of attention. And once those boundaries shift, the nature of the siege itself is no longer absolute. As the narrative of Dothan expands across time, from ancient siege to modern invisible pressures, it eventually arrives at a final convergence point. Not a conclusion of events, but a conclusion of perception. The story stops being about armies, cities, or even specific historical actors such as Elisha or the forces of Syria. Instead, it becomes about the architecture of awareness itself. Because when all layers are considered together, a pattern emerges that transcends geography and era. Reality is never only what is physically measurable, it is also what is cognitively constructed. And the most decisive conflicts are not those fought in visible space, but those fought in interpretive space, inside the structure of how a mind organizes what it perceives. This is the central synthesis of the entire Dothan framework: the visible siege, the unseen army, the expansion of perception, the strategic blindness, the ethical reframing of power, and the modern invisible pressures. All of these are not separate stories. They are variations of a single underlying principle, that human experience is always mediated through layers of interpretation. And it is within these layers that conflict is either amplified or dissolved. At the most fundamental level, what Dothan reveals is that reality is not equivalent to what can be measured. Measurement captures only one layer, the physical. But human experience is always built from multiple layers operating simultaneously: physical events, emotional responses, cognitive models, and symbolic meaning structures. When these layers are misaligned, perception collapses into distortion. When they are aligned, perception becomes coherent, even in unstable environments. This is why the greatest conflict in the narrative is never purely external. It is internal to perception itself. The real battleground is not the city under siege, but the mind interpreting the siege. From this emerges a core principle that governs all stages of the story. What is seen determines what is feared. What is understood determines what is threatening. A person standing in the same environment as another may experience completely different realities, not because the external conditions differ, but because the interpretive frameworks differ. The servant at Dothan initially experiences total vulnerability because his perceptual system defines the situation as closed. Elisha, by contrast, operates within a framework that includes additional layers of reality and therefore does not interpret the same conditions as absolute. This leads to a structural reversal. Fear is not generated by danger alone, but by the interpretation of danger as total and unbounded. When perception expands, fear does not necessarily disappear, but it loses its absolute authority. This is the deeper logic behind the opening of eyes moment. It is not the introduction of new physical forces, but the reconfiguration of what counts as relevant information in the first place. Across the broader narrative arc, this principle repeats in different forms. The Syrian military experiences tactical blindness not because it lacks capability, but because its model of reality does not account for interpretive interference. Their strength remains intact, but their alignment with reality becomes unstable. Their defeat, therefore, is not purely physical, it is epistemic. They lose not only position, but certainty about position. This is why the most consistent message throughout Dothan is not about domination, but about awareness. And within this awareness lies a second principle. The structures that protect are often larger than the structures that threaten. In the physical scene, this is represented by the unseen forces surrounding the city, symbolic mountains of fire that exceed the visible army in scale and presence. In modern interpretation, it reflects the idea that stabilizing systems, whether psychological, social, or existential, are often more extensive than the immediate pressures that appear dominant. Yet these protective structures are not always perceived because perception itself is selective. It highlights threat more easily than support, danger more easily than continuity. This asymmetry is what creates the illusion of isolation. The transformation of perception, therefore, is not about denying risk. It is about restoring proportionality. Risk exists, but it is not total. Pressure exists, but it is not singular. Threat exists, but it is not singular. Threat exists, but it is not total. Pressure 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 exists, but it is not singular. Threat exists, but it is not unopposed. This leads to the final ethical and cognitive orientation of the entire framework, a mode of awareness that can be described as strategic clarity. Strategic clarity does not mean ignorance of danger. It does not mean denial of instability. Instead, it requires simultaneous recognition of two realities. First, that threats are real and must be acknowledged without distortion. Second, that threats are never the only active structure within a system. To live in this awareness is to avoid two extremes, denial on one side and totalizing fear on the other. It is to remain engaged with reality without collapsing reality into a single narrative of vulnerability. This is why the final instruction of the Dothan framework is not control, but sight. Not dominance, but calibration of perception. The invitation is to open the eyes, not once, but continuously, to refine what is seen, how it is seen, and what is assumed to be absolute. In this state of awareness, conflict does not disappear, but its meaning changes. It becomes one layer among many, not the defining totality of experience. And in that shift, something fundamental occurs. The world is no longer interpreted as a closed siege, but as an open system with multiple interacting forces, some visible, some hidden, some threatening, and some stabilizing. To recognize this is to enter the final insight of Dothan, that the most decisive transformation is not the removal of external pressure, but the restoration of depth to perception itself. And in that depth, fear loses its monopoly, because reality is revealed to be larger than any single way of seeing it.